Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming, and to all of those who've come over 32 years to listen to these lectures and participate in this wonderful event. So thank you once again for coming, and particularly thank you to so many of my friends who are here tonight. So thank you very, very much for coming. Stephen Murray-Smith is no longer the celebrated figure he was in 1988 when he died at 65. His achievements in so many ways live on, and his archive in the State Library is a physical embodiment of his remarkable life. But inevitably, absence fades names and glory, which is why my sister Cleve and brother David and I, as well as our mother Nita when she was alive, have prized so deeply these State Library lectures in his name. This remarkable series of speakers investigating with complexity and personality their passions and preoccupations has reflected Dad's love of the library, his passionate excitement about progress, about literature, about Australia, and the broadness of his interests. Many brilliant speakers have reflected on and built upon his mighty contribution to Australian history, literature, social justice, and have kept his name alive. Some speakers knew him, some did not. The personal comments of those who did were always a highlight for us kids. Dad epitomised the courage of the public intellectual, prepared to throw themselves into the Colosseum and face the lions. He knew that conviction itself is most valuable when it engages with equal and opposite conviction. It's the conversation that matters. This is almost certainly the reason that I'm a playwright, listening in on the equal and opposing voices of my parents and their friends, discussing the world until the early hours of summer nights, and feeling the power of the argument switch from person to person according to their execution of language. As we were growing up, my father was constantly in the media, quoted, sought after for public events and speeches. The literary magazine he founded and edited, Overland, was a significant player in the literary left. His letters decorated the broadsheet letters pages with his cogent and economically worded commentaries on everything from lighthouses to where the streetlights should be positioned coming down Oliver's Hill from Mount Eliza, in the middle so as not to obscure the view. He was an early conservationist, a lover of islands, of music, a middle-of-the-night reader, an indefatigable supporter of those less well-positioned in life, from the son of a Bass Strait fisherman for whom he drove through Gippsland to offer a character reference in court, to aspiring writers who doubted the importance of their own stories. So many people have said to me, he was the one who gave me the courage to write. There were legendary punctuation points to his life: blowing up bridges in New Guinea during the war, meeting Picasso, being the Melbourne rep of the Angry Penguins, reviewing the Beatles in Melbourne, and then with Nita hosting the Hungarian Olympic team at our house in Mount Eliza under the watchful eyes of the secret police. Throwing parties for Pete Seeger, and then there was the night the poet Robert Graves drank champagne out of my mother's shoe, understandably to her equal parts horror and delight. He was a wonderful father to me, but he had his faults. He was certainly at war with unresolved emotions, unsurprising in someone whose life revolved around 4 institutions: boarding school, the army, communism, and academia. His time in New Guinea as an 18-year-old commando inevitably left him with unspoken wounds. At Geelong Grammar, desperately homesick at 12, he wrote of his tears as he heard the whistle of the nearby train for Melbourne from Cuffy House. Yet as he grew older, the school furnished him with many positive lifelong traits, including, under Fabian principal J.R. Darling, an appetite for social justice, literature, and a tolerance for different perspectives. Dad had a difficult youth, characterised by both an affection for his parents and a conscientious objection to their world: bourgeois, snobbish, artistically impoverished, and conservative. And this undoubtedly played a role in his falling in love with and marrying our mother Nita, a beautiful, clever Jewish refugee with whom he eloped to London and Prague in 1948, passionate not just about one another, but about communism. Working for the communist news agency Telepress in Prague, Dad was responsible for any news about the Asia-Pacific region and wrote articles about the Czech experience for the communist press back home. It's hard for me to reconcile his upbeat reports on the regime with the father I knew. In 1950 or 51, he reported that Czechoslovakia was, quote, a confident, happy country where everything is on the upgrade. 20 years later, in 1971, we spent a year in Europe. I was 8, and it was many years since they'd realised communism was a false god. One of my most vivid memories was the silent tension in our combi van as we crossed the Czech border, knowing that Dad had taped on a secret panel of the vehicle an enlarged black and white photograph of the ominous Russian tanks rolling down the streets of Prague to put on the cover of Overland. With the leaking of the Khrushchev report in '56, detailing the brutality of Stalin, came a shocking awakening. It was the end of an all-consuming and tragic love affair. They abandoned deep friendships with those who elected to stay in the party and lost the centrifugal force of their lives and identities. We kids, or at least I didn't, I think none of us, got much insight into that sense of betrayal and self-betrayal. They didn't linger there, and by the time I was born in the 60s, they were regular Labor voters with a deep contempt for ideological dogma of any kind. With characteristic pragmatism, they emerged from that traumatic break, bruised but also wiser and more human. The extreme left was at least as bad as the extreme right, because, as my mother often said, the left ought to know better. The passion of their political beliefs transferred into literature, and Overland became the headquarters of their vision, passion, nationalism, and progressivism. The state of the world still mattered, but it was clearly easier to influence through the pages of the magazine than by starting a commune in Russia, as their ASIO files incorrectly reported. Dad accessed them through freedom of information, and with the characteristic pedantry of the historian, annotated them with what was and wasn't true and sent them back. They had a cultural patriotism it's harder to identify these days. In Overland's pages was a literary nation building, an ongoing investigation into what it meant to be an Australian, through the lens of social analysis, art, poetry and fiction. This lecture series was commissioned by the State Library as part of their acquisition of Stephen's literary archive, including his extraordinary correspondence with most of the great Australian and some international writers of the second half of the 20th century, a quirky, compelling and unique literary treasure for scholars interested in the birth of modernism in Australia and the evolution of the Australian voice in writing. Stephen was the first to publish Tim Winton, Peter Carey and many others. Many other, I'd like to say, household names, but this being Australia, alas, not quite. He was the first Australian editor to publish a magazine edition of entirely Indigenous writers, and it was fitting that one of the most moving lectures was Alexis Wright's in 2018, which touched on the censorship of Indigenous storytellers. Quote, "One small thing that I have in common with Stephen Murray-Smith is that I also came from a home that was bookless. But even so, I would not have traded that childhood that was enriched every day by the oral storytelling culture of my family and our people. I read that Stephen Murray-Smith had unswerving principles about the things he believed in, and I am sometimes like this too." Most of the speakers have had unswerving principles about the things they believed in, which made this such a vital and vivid event, housed in the most important institution of the city. Bruce Pascoe, Frank Morehouse, Gareth Evans, Julian Burnside, Ken Inglis, Evelyn Araluen, Claire Wright, Maxine McHugh, Jeff Blaney, Ken Inglis, Robert Mann and so many others have contributed to the series. Cleve, David and I are hugely grateful to them all and to those working behind the scenes at the library, all the library heads, including of course Paul, and in particular Susie Gaspar. Their support through the last 32 years for this invaluable extension and enhancement of Stephen's own contribution to Australian life was, they're the reason that it's here. We three kids didn't always agree with the speakers. I always looked forward to the post-mortem with them or with each other about them, but that wasn't the point. Those of us who work within it are continuously defeated by the lack of regard for the arts by our political leaders, a reluctance to see an artistic education as crucial to the whole child, in families and in schools, the lack of acknowledgement of the value of the arts in political campaigns, and the complete inadequacy of financial compensation for artists. Most painful, perhaps, the lack of the recognition of that the arts, more than anything, export the national character to the rest of the world. Just as Dad was raised in a bookless house in Toorak, complete with Indian servant and other staff, there are plenty of bookless Toorak houses a century later. When an American academic, Cynthia Running-Johnson, discussed the public funding of theatre in France with a French theatre director, she noted that French funding is around 10 times greater per capita than in the US, and congratulated the French state for its generosity. The director's response, "We are the state." The Australia Council for the Arts, the government's primary arts funding and advisory body, will dedicate $230 million by 2025-26. But many institutions will see a decrease in support, along with the National Archives, the National Gallery, Screen Australia, and many others. Diminishing support for this institution we are sitting in tonight is frankly the reason this is the final lecture in the series. There is a small building with a tiny playing space in an inner city Melbourne neighbourhood that for more than half a century has offered an unofficial apprenticeship to the leading theatre practitioners, actors, designers, writers, directors of this country. La Mama, started by the legendary firebrand Betty Burstall, who I was terrified of in my youth, has probably ignited the careers of more greats in the performing arts than NIDA. When a fire tore through the beloved Carlton Theatre in 2018, $3 million was raised through philanthropy to rebuild it. The people spoke. But what about the bureaucrats? This year, La Mama announced that due to the rejection for support from Creative Australia for 25 to 28, it is forced to close its doors next year. The lack of perspective here is astonishing, a seemingly willful blindness to the independent theatre companies like La Mama or Red Stitch or TheatreWorks, and how the trickle-up effect comes to fruition on the Oscars stage in the top arts companies and spaces around the world. La Mama actors and writers and directors go on to sell the Australian imagination to the world. They elevate this nation, often without mentorship, income or recognition, through personal determination and talent. Most successful professional Australian artists learn their craft without direct funding, often without education, without state pride, admiration, support, despite poverty, shrinking arts pages, and barely a single attendance at the theatre of a single politician since Federation, with a few notable exceptions. A few have recently been cited, a little show called Julia. Narcissists. Kate Blanchett began acting at La Mama, as did so many of our great actors and directors and designers, who started under a single wobbly light on that little Carlton stage and are now globally illuminated. $300,000. That's what it takes to make a nation bloom. No Australian encounters foreigners extolling the virtues of Alan Joyce or James Packer or Gina Reinhardt. It's our artists who punch this nation well above its weight. And when an Australian artist rises up, takes a spectacular cultural mark on the global oval, like Archie Moore winning this year's Venice Biennale with his work Country, the rhapsodic pride reverberates around the same corridors of power that have specialised in keeping artists like him largely poor and unacknowledged. I remember meeting George Brandis at a private lunch when he was Minister for the Arts in 2013. For nearly 2 decades, I'd had plays on Broadway, at the National in London, on the West End and all over the world in dozens of languages. I was, with Daniel Keane, the most produced Australian playwright on foreign stages. He said as he was introduced to me. Yes, I think I've heard of you. I was unsurprised by this, but it was the fact that I was unsurprised that made me so mad. In Dad's politics, progressiveness, empathy for the underdog, dislike of pretension, and forensic interest in the lives of literally everyone he met, he lived at a complex intersection of idealism, compassion, rigour, and pragmatism. Idealism is a complicated notion. Subjective, influenced by changing contexts, fashion, histories, it is under extreme scrutiny right now. Idealism was seen by my parents and their friends as belonging to institutions or political systems, communism, the labour movement, feminism, conservation groups, and so on. For my generation, perhaps, it is more often seen as a force formed outside of institutions, more ideological insurrection focused on changing them. Now we are subjected to a bureaucratic idealistic orthodoxy, trampling through the verdant garden of the Australian imagination. A well-intentioned, badly instigated manual on correct thinking, adopted by bureaucracies seeking to underline their credibility in a frighteningly judgmental world, insidiously working against the national imagination, insistent that it falls into line. This is part of a hypocritical groupthink invading every aspect of life, from the declarative bronze plaques on houses worth millions insisting we are on the land of the Wurundjeri, through to the kids I talked to in Collins Place with banners saying, "From the river to the sea," who couldn't tell you where Israel was. At times, these might be seen as reassuring gestures in the right direction. They are at least a nod to looking beyond one's own shadow. But really, what is the value of displaying your progressive thinking if there's no nuance, no complexity, and no real sacrifice? As a young writer, my sense of morality was not a conscious element in my work. I knew that in as much as I had a sense of morality, it would be present in my plays just as it was there effortlessly, unproclaimed, in the Henry Lawson stories Dad read me at night as a child. Stories so human, so deft, that the moral perspective looked after itself. My job, as I saw it, was not that complicated. It was to create as truthfully as possible human beings, to populate stories which revealed something about the world we live in, a mission that kept itself in check quite easily. If I didn't write truthfully, the play wouldn't work. If a play was uninteresting, intellectually obvious, repetitive, emotionally dishonest, the actors would reveal it and the audience would show me. Sitting in the audience was literally trial by jury. That is the artist's apprenticeship. It can be painful to grow up in public, but you know it's the cost, and you know the cost is worth it. As I've said many times before, you only need to be 51% ego to 49% vulnerability to survive as an artist. You need doubt, you need fear, you need chaos, you need mystery. All the things that normal people try to avoid or suppress is your gold. But bit by bit, you learn what it is you have to say, and that the job is to reach into the world and to be as honest and complex and unresolved and questioning and flawed on the page as you are off it. Because a writer who knows too much won't write with wonder or poetry or truth. This is the freedom of the professional artist in any form. This is the freedom that we come to. It's not exactly self-belief, because that's not only elusive but also a mixed blessing. It is an acceptance, uncertainty, and a refusal to give up. The two are held together in an infuriating but compelling chorus. I'm not sure I'm any good, but I've found my own way of seeing the world. This is what Oscar Wilde described as the most intense mode of individualism that the world has known. In American novelist and essayist Mary Gaitskill's book of essays, Oppositions, she takes a look at an essay she wrote in 2013 in praise of Nabokov's Lolita, in which she observed that Humbert's desire for Dolly is made, quote, more delicious by the sharp tonal oppositions in her twofold nature, unquote. Forced to acknowledge that one could not write that essay the same way post-Me Too, she writes, quote, the idea that a paedophile might love the target of his obsession is, to put it mildly, very out of style. I can easily imagine that someone else might more prosecutorially ask, excuse me? You think that the paedophile's desire is made more delicious by what exactly? My answer: if Humbert Humbert were a real person, I would be outraged myself at the characterisation of his desire as delicious. But he is not a real person. He is fictional. That is, he is an intense illusion, an artful imitation of thought, instinct, feeling, and physical phenomena, so flawlessly made that we respond to him as if he were actually human, but he is not." Unquote. Evolving into an artist is about accumulating and recognising within you the preoccupations that crawl uninvited into every crevice of your mind and heart, the burgeoning personal sense of what is right and wrong, the gradual miraculous understanding of what it is you are capable of saying powerfully, of how to say it, of silencing the cynicism that all stories have been told before and better. Becoming a professional artist in any discipline requires an acceptance of both our limitations and our strengths. This combined audacity and humility is ours. It's what makes us. But this individual sensibility is being stolen from us by an increasingly dogmatic cultural zeitgeist that wants us all to feel the same way. Our own sense and sensibility, which accounts for not just the content of our work, but also for the taste that lies behind it, the moral judgment on the world, has been co-opted by a culture that imposes its point of view and insists we fall into line. We are now in an epidemic of dictatorial values that squeezes the life out of the artist's individuality. This is not just Australia, of course. In a brilliant essay in the Yale Review, American novelist and poet Garth Greenwell writes of contemporary pressures for artists to conform to a moral code. Quote, "There's a desire for art to be exemplary, to present a world the moral valence of which, whether positive or negative, is easily legible. There's a desire for the work of art to provide an index of judgment clearly predicated on values the reader can approve. We want the work to give us a place to stand that grants access to righteousness, a place from which to judge a work or its characters. But more and more, I question the role of this kind of judgment in moral life." Unquote. Let's take trigger warnings, now scattered all over our academies, our art spaces, our screens. I'm all for trigger warnings, so long as they are for boring plays. This play may distress those who have experienced boredom and resentment over having their own sentiments needlessly affirmed. Warning, this play may have negative effects over those who fought and won against staying home and binging slow horses. During the development of a play, sometimes over a few years, writers take notes from directors, artistic directors, literary managers, and others. When writing Julia, a play that attempts to imaginatively construct the interior life of Julia Gillard, I attributed her political affinities in part to her close relationship with her father, a Welshman keenly aware of the tragedies that befell the working men in the mines that serviced the British Empire. I had some sense of her connection to her father, in part through her outrage at Alan Jones's suggestion that her father died of shame. But my Julia was an informed fiction, and the emotional power of it, such as it was, would only be serviced by my emotions, not hers. At the Sydney Opera House last week, after the 100th show, a sponsor, knowing I had interviewed her, asked me about the intense influence of her father on her conscience. To be honest, I replied, I have no idea if it's true. It felt true because I was unconsciously writing about my father and me. As usual, a realisation that only happened when I was sitting in the auditorium of the Opera House watching the play. This is how naive the writer can be. I'm literally sitting there watching and thinking, Jesus, that bit there, that's me and Dad. Dad could be impossible. He could be authoritarian and rarely, but memorably on the home front, enraged. But with remarkable consistency, he maintained a deep feeling for the so-called common man, a forensic instinct for injustice, and a belief that kindness was the paramount virtue by which one valued one's success as a human being. He failed sometimes with those closest to him, but he was, I think, acutely depressed by these failures, as good people are. My subconscious knew that the power of my feelings about my father could be used, yes, exploited, to give authenticity to Julia Gillard's relationship with her father. I believed she had at times been a traitor to her own morality about refugees, about marriage equality, the reduction of single mother pension, and that this morality was in her DNA, which made her betrayal of those values one of the most painful costs of power. Entirely conjecture, but probably this through line made my portrait of her and the play itself work as a persuasive psychological hypothetical. I received a series of notes on an early draft from the theatre company. I'm not even sure who from. They weren't signed. One of which was that I ought to be careful not to portray her loving relationship with her father as, quote, patriarchal hero worship, unquote. In the play, I voiced a fictional crude Sydney shock jock to illustrate what kind of crudity Julia Gillard had to deal with day in, day out. My shock jock uses the word leso. I was asked to take the word out of the play as it would offend members of the Sydney Theatre Company audience. I write back to the effect of, why protect homophobic shock jocks? Why censor and curate the world of the play for audience members perfectly capable of differentiating the values of a character from the values of the company that produces the play, and even the writer who writes it? In Julia, I cite Gillian Clarke's poem about the 1962 mine disaster in the town of Six Bells in Wales. Clarke describes a woman in the town hearing the siren of the mine collapse as she's hanging up the wedding sheets to dry. It's an astonishingly understated but devastating poem about the swift feet of tragedy. The image of her lifting the sheets to the washing line perfectly conflates the miner's wife's life and marriage in the sheets and the revelation that this life is over. The note I get back: do you think citing a woman hanging up the washing is appropriate given Julia, the subject of the play, championed feminist issues? At the moment, I should add that if it weren't for the Sydney Theatre Company, I'd be out of work. This company consistently engages with my work and ideas, and they've been incredibly supportive of me in recent years, the most supportive. And at the Sydney Theatre Company, I am currently surrounded by really brilliant theatre minds. It wasn't my idea to write Julia, it was Kip Williams' idea, the artistic director, and hugely successful theatre maker himself. You would have seen his Dorian Gray, I'm sure some of you, whose astuteness in gauging what audiences want is formidable. Compared to stage managers I've worked with all over the world, Australians are the best. The same with our designers, set and sound designers, our lighting designers, our video designers, among the best in the world. I continue to work with extraordinarily talented directors, such as Sarah Goods, who directed Julia and Switzerland and Three Little Words, whom I admire and love. The literary advisor at the STC, Ruth Little, has a superb sensibility and guides me in achieving the very best that I can from the intention of the play. From all of these people, as well as exceptionally insightful members of the company administration, I get vital responses making me a much better writer and to whom I'm hugely indebted. They are smart people who are working to make their corner of the world an enlightened place to be, but they are, like me, carrying an obligation that defies and denies their talent, an expectation that they will follow, not lead, that they will join the cult of the orthodoxy and include on every company missive the phrases safe space and inclusive. Art isn't a safe space. Of course, we need proper processes to protect actors from any kind of harm. Goes without saying. But let's keep the volume of noise about human vulnerability at a scale that matches the problem and return our gaze to the artistic mission. Let's be sensible. Let's keep our eye on the ball. On the homepage of a highly regarded London theatre is this, quote, "We believe that language is important and empowering. Where possible, we are as specific as possible with our language and avoid defaulting to umbrella terms or making assumptions about people's identity or experience. When we can't be specific, we say black people and people in the global majority instead of phrases like person of colour and BAME. This is because the term black people and people in the global majority does not centre whiteness and is also factually true. Over 80% of the world's population make up the global majority. Thank you for that. Let's redress the wrongs and tackle the human problems. Of course we must. But please, our plays will do this better than your mission statements, because the act of art, when it's good, is always progress. Put your moral urgency on the stage, not on your websites. Now, it's all very well for me to want our arts companies to lead, to stop with the jargon and the declarations of alliance, blah, 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 and actually get shit done. But if they don't join the cult, there are consequences. Young actors raised to be hypersensitive to cultural difference, to their own vulnerability, to be ready for discrimination with an automatic suspicion towards what has gone before, will revolt in the rehearsal room. Complaints will be made and bureaucratic inquiries initiated. Board meetings will be called, funding may be lost, sponsors may fall away. When my friend was directing a Shakespeare in London, she faced a mutiny in the rehearsal room. It was suggested by the actors that the word Turks be changed to infidels in order, presumably, to camouflage the bad guys. Her crime was to pause before agreeing. In this pause, she had apparently displayed unforgivably racist recalcitrance. This was raised with management, and management took the side of the actors. Hostile meetings ensued, betrayal, pain. The most beguiling, progressive and sensitive, and may I say leftist director in London was, at least for a while, destroyed. It seems unfortunate to have to point out that when Shakespeare wrote the word Turks, the relationship between Elizabethan England and the Ottoman Empire wasn't fantastic. Our rehearsal rooms, rather than depicting the attitudes and, yes, prejudices of history, are now determined to fix them. What does this do to our understanding of history? Who is the judge? I mean, I'm genuinely asking this question. Who is the judge who bears greater weight than the artist? Which time period wins? As an audience, we are free to decry someone else's expression, avoid it, wrestle with it, argue against it. But does the act of correction keep art relevant, or is it vandalism? When talking about the art and culture in the early 1990s, the philosopher Alain Badiou observed, truths have been concealed, art has become culture, love has become sexuality, science has become technology, and politics management. We are now fighting the expansion of that cold bureaucracy, where artistic expression has become a moral internship. Art is visceral, passionate, energetic inquiry. Its power is splashing around in the mud and the filth, in the fucking and the loving and the hating and the longing and the danger. It's posing of unanswerable questions and then the walking all over them with sensory experience. It's negotiating a tightrope and asking the audience to individually save or push. Artists explore themselves and their world with the discipline of craft, but the freedom of going where they are driven to go. Artists float around life simultaneously inside and outside it, judging it inevitably, but from their own profoundly personal perspective. The artist's floating view and emotional freedom is what moves us when the theatre moves us. It's what has always moved us. Sometimes it's captivating, sometimes repellent, but the freedom to be so is its pulse. This pulse is being beaten up by a bureaucracy so frightened by the power of a fingertip on a laptop key, a thoughtless send, and the ensuing cancellation that, left alone inside its contagion, it will shut us down. Now, when writing or making, a wise artist, in any form pretty much, must imagine a trial at which they are the defendant and amend their work to ensure an innocent verdict. It was once the artist's duty to provoke, not placate, to seduce, not preach, to confuse, not simplify, to enchant, to energise, to worry, to invite catastrophe, and yes, even cancellation, that dreaded word, that new leprosy, that is filling metaphorical prisons with artists who will not contort their creative ambitions into moral certainty. My play Berlin is about a young Jewish man, Tom, who meets a young German girl, Charlotte, in a club in Berlin. Over the course of the night in her apartment, these young lovers must wrestle with the ghosts of the Holocaust, victims and perpetrators, and the philosophical question of whether a line can ever be drawn under the crimes of the past. Optioned at the start of COVID by a West End producer, it has taken now years to have anything come of it in London. It was originally, as Paul mentioned, produced and commissioned by the Melbourne Theatre Company. A prominent London theatre asked for a reading to decide whether or not to produce it. The young actor playing Tom was dynamite, and the theatre committed to programming it in 2025. I haven't been this happy since Honour was done at the National 20 years ago. That we have found our perfect Tom is also thrilling to the director and me. What every writer wants is for the audience to forget that the story they are watching is a feat of engineering. Yes, it starts as a wisp of smoke, emanating from the subconscious. But by the time the rehearsal draft is written and the play is on, an army of dream makers have moved in to disguise every possible reminder that this is a work of fiction. Those prop makers and set designers and script editors and on and on and on are all consumed by a rigorous process to camouflage the fact that it's all made up. If it works, the play will seduce, entertain, provoke, and elicit emotion. It will hold attention that allows the audience to suspend disbelief and for just a moment, or 90 minutes, forget their real life and just enter mine. For that, we need the right actors, ones prepared to dive so deeply into their own emotional reservoir that they can bring this conviction to the characters and sell the story. I have my first Zoom with the AD of the theatre. I'm ready for the conversation about how a Jewish-themed play may attract antagonism, despite having no connection with the Israeli government or politics. Such is the rise of anti-Semitism. Jewish characters in all stories, by virtue of their racial identity, are potentially problematic. This is our world now. My play is not so much about Jewish themes as it is about how the memory of any terrible history coexists with the present. It might just as easily be about Australia's colonialist past, or France's, or about America and slavery. Tom could be the descendant of a slave in the American South, and Charlotte the descendant of a slave owner. The point for me is, how do young people break down historical enmities? Is the only way to do it to forget? Is it even possible to forget when a place still evokes and preserves history so powerfully, such as Berlin? Is to forget, to forgive, an immoral act when memory is a vital insurance against the past resurrecting? This conversation I'm ready for, but instead the artistic director proclaims that the theatre absolutely cannot cast a non-Jewish actor in a Jewish role. So the brilliant actor of the reading is out. This is not just this theatre, it's the new reality. A recent production of Richard III at the Globe starred the artistic director Michelle Terry. There was no controversy over a woman in the role, but the Disabled Artists Alliance described the casting of the able-bodied Terry as offensive and distasteful, stating that the play cannot be successfully performed with a non-physically disabled actor at the helm. We don't want straight guys playing gay roles, we don't want gay guys playing trans male to female roles, and we definitely don't want non-Jewish actors playing Jews. But don't worry, drag is okay because it's cool. The artistic director of the theatre points out to me, we don't want to subject a non-Jewish actor to anti-Semitic vilification, should it come to that. Because, well, not that anyone deserves it, but he really doesn't deserve it because, poor guy, he's not even Jewish. Too bad about acting school. Too bad about training, about empathy, too bad about the imagination, too bad about the purpose of art itself, to transgress the boundaries between people and types and backgrounds, and collect them inside a united and profound expression of common humanity. What does acting become when it is relegated to ghettos of real histories, when it diminishes the very nature of becoming someone else, of walking in others' shoes, of transgressing reality and entering the profound territory of becoming other. And where does the insistence on cultural affinity end? Could, say, an actress with no experience of sexual assault play a victim of sexual assault? What about class? Can we have posh actors playing gravediggers? I argue my point of view, but as I admit to them, it's all very well for me. I'm not running a theatre company in London in 2024. They want the best for the play. The director and I then enter a surreal conversation. We need a 20 to 30-year-old star who is somehow Jewish. Maybe even a Jewish dad will do. It's fine if they've never been to Passover and enjoy Christmas shopping at Harrods, so long as the marketing department can say he's Jewish. If you fight back on these issues, you're often judged to be on side with the reactionary forces you're trying to expose. I took Lezo out of Julia, reluctantly, because I had to pick my battles, but I'm still rattled when it's suggested that audiences are unable to see the difference between reproducing homophobic or racist or transphobic or sexist or colonialist or patriarchal language to faithfully represent an aspect of the world we live in and the actual views of the storytellers. And if the storytellers do believe in things that we find reprehensible, isn't the stage the place to listen, reflect, and then fight back in life, or indeed on the stage? If we cancel our artists because we don't like what they think, who gets to judge? Is it fair to bypass the courts and judge in the court of public opinion? I'm not, like comedian Hannah Gadsby, prepared to dismiss Picasso as a bastard and a womaniser. I know lots of bastards and none of them can paint that well, so I'll give a pass to the one who can. I don't have to love him to stand in awe of some of his paintings. And when I'm entranced by a Gerhard Richter, am I obligated to research his home life to justify my emotional reaction? Aren't we all, every one of us, living in a glass house? If we judge the art by the artists, there's a chance our companies and galleries and publishing houses would stand empty and mute. Aren't the arts where this truth-telling belongs, reflecting back to us on our stages the world we sometimes cannot or will not recognise in the full light of day? Garth Greenwell writes about his students whose, quote, primary mode of engagement with a text often seems to be a particular kind of moral judgment, as though before they can see anything else in stories or poems, they have to sort them into piles of the righteous and the problematic, unquote. This is, he says, quote, a kind of paranoia about our own moral status, a desire to demonstrate our personal righteousness in our response to art, unquote. This is understandable in a generation, like most generations, that wants to correct the failures of the previous ones. The push for diversity on our stages and screens is, of course, incredibly important. Creative minorities must be part of the ranks, not only because they deserve to be, but because our society is increasingly diverse and our stages should reflect that. But few artistic directors, theatre makers or cultural commentators are willing to discuss or even acknowledge the complexities that come with this. Sometimes, it happens, inexperienced minority actors are being cast purely for their cultural background to make up the numbers for the company's diversity policy. Let's not congratulate ourselves on acts designed to satisfy the optics, but rather on actions that result in real change, which goes deeper, is harder. To be fair, many of our companies are now creating programs for writers from diverse backgrounds. MTC, STC, QTC are all doing this. In turn, creating diverse casting opportunities. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing for ghettoising actors of colour. There are many plays where the racial preoccupations of the audience can and have been, racial preconceptions of the audience can and have been challenged with great success. But when casting is purely about policy, however well-intentioned, everyone loses. Do people see race? We know they do, because history, including our own history, is the story of race. Can we discuss it? No. Is it right that we can't discuss it? I don't know. Writers have always rewritten history, but what responsibility do artists have to avoid romanticising history by casting black actors for historically white characters, when such casting camouflages true and terrible social realities? I want the world to be better and fairer, but frankly, I also want everything to be in the service of the play. We are very aware of the closed-mindedness of the right, but the vetoing of complexities, the swift condemnation of those who present them, are faults of both political extremes. Certainly, the simplistic moral posturing of the left is its Achilles heel, and in the end will sabotage progress by alienating allies who champion common sense. Our arts institutions anticipate conservative forces to be so damaging that self-criticism is considered too dangerous. But as Princeton professor Robert P. George said last month in the New York Times, intellectual humility is an essential virtue in anyone who sincerely seeks the truth. Last year I saw a play in London preceded by a spokesperson on stage who announced very soberly that any neurologically diverse members of the audience who felt uncomfortable sitting through the play were welcome to spontaneously get up and leave. I could imagine hundreds suddenly becoming neurologically diverse. I felt appalled at the pressure that this put the actors under, expected to paralyse in thin air while footsteps penetrate and evaporate the invented reality. Now that planes are equipped with Wi-Fi, the theatre remains the only public space where patrons have no escape from boredom. It's the only place left to take a child where they can't scroll, chat, upload, download, or purchase something with a small box in their hand. That sacred space of theatre is becoming more and more sacred for this reason. It's a place of uninterrupted spells, a collusion between the collective focus of the audience and the collective focus of the performers, whose mercurial charisma invites them in and keeps them there. Let us hold on to the one place left to be immersed. Let us show our children the occasional ecstasy of immersion. When representations of sexual and family violence are toned down for fear of triggering audiences with personal experiences in sexual violence, what is the effect of the preservation of comfort? As the wonderful, anonymously written little book, Why Culture Matters, puts it, we should develop the confidence to do exactly that which we might feel discouraged to do, relate cultural masterpieces to our own dilemmas and pains, using them as a resource with which to address a range of our most debilitating and pernicious agonies. Why am I a writer? In a large part because of the Wooster Group's astonishing production of The Crucible at the Adelaide Theatre, Adelaide Festival, from which Ray and I in our early 20s emerged changed. Or a film I was taken to at 7 called Island of the Blue Dolphins at the Chelsea Plaza, which is still the most terrifying film I've ever seen. Because of Judi Dench and Ian McKellen and Macbeth in London as a teenager with Mum, or watching On the Beach with Granny when I was 10, what was she thinking? Or The White Ribbon or Breaking the Waves, all of these works of which were violent, disturbing, gripping and terrifying. It was Thomas Hardy and Flaubert as a 17-year-old, and The Transit of Venus and The Man Who Loved Children during the university years, and Siri Hustved's What I Loved when I had little children, and Emmanuel Carrère's Lives Other Than My Own during the pandemic. These and a million other creative works made me feel how astonishingly wonderful and how utterly unbearable life was. It was the violent alteration that art could ignite. It was unmistakably power. It was the temporary inhabitation of worlds completely other than my own that became, by the stealth of words or images or sounds, absolutely my own. It was the explosion of emotion and gratitude and envy ignited in me by others. This was art, a vehicle to change and be changed. I might not be any good at it, but how could you settle for anything less, knowing what it could do? The swift moral judgment of art and artists risks evaporating this power, forcing us all towards the same summit of the same mountain of righteous sanctity. Artists are what they are in relation to themselves, not in relation to applause or condemnation or from fear of the zeitgeist's assassination. The inability to hold these conversations which dissect what really is progress and what is simply the pretense at it. For fear of discrediting our own integrity is a direct descendant of my parents' blinkeredness to communism, most perfectly rendered in my mother's tears at Stalin's death. Little wonder I inherited their belief in the need for the left to be forensic about its self-congratulation. Theatre companies, so wonderfully well positioned to fight for the arts, for artistic freedom, for inspiring and extolling diverse voices, must not become lost in a maze of political correctness formed in response to the viral vitriol of knee-jerk vigilantes. I've come to recognise in myself so much of my father that as a younger woman and writer I probably repressed. The single-minded focus to get things done has served me well and taught me, most usefully during the early childhood years, taught me to deep dive into my imagination in a supermarket queue, an airline seat, in a cab. But most importantly, I think I got from Dad a belief in the imagination's capacity to explore ideas that might be touchy, that might sometimes put one's sense of the truth in direct opposition to social conformity, that can be summed up as a willingness to challenge the deeply held beliefs of others and oneself. Words can do that. And most wonderfully, when they are brought to three-dimensional life in the mouths of actors who will risk night after night, who will go out there under the lights and take a chance on big ideas, still unproven, and then get out of the boat and ride their bike home in the rain because they can't afford an Uber to Yarraville. That is the job of art, isn't it? To imagine our ways into not just the presentation of our own experience or be missionaries for our own beliefs, but to accurately and equally inhabit and present the experiences of others, sometimes our ideological enemies, to conquer the divide. It's in ambiguity that art, like life, is most interesting. The job of art is to take us simultaneously to places we've never been and to that place deep within us that might rarely be acknowledged, the place of our greatest fears and loves, to conquer indifference, to entertain, to expose those frisky, febrile thoughts of the creator to the world we share. An artwork does not belong to any agenda, not even any avowed agenda of the artist. If I start a play knowing exactly what I believe, then my job as I write is to unpick my certainty, to let in light where I'm scared of it falling. To make art is not to be polemical, but to be alive to ambiguity and excited by making oneself and others feel. Mostly artists rely on the craft to rein in the art, knowing that without the craft it's unwatchable, but without the art it doesn't deserve to be watched. If I'm not surprised by what I've written, I throw it away. It's the subconscious that takes us to interesting places, not the part of us that is conscious feminist or environmentalist or communist. It's the rebellion of our unconscious minds that really tells the story about what it is to be human. In a social media-driven world that is infatuated with confidence, self-doubt has been tainted, despite the fact that at the heart of art is sometimes to be wrong. The will to fail, to believe, to discover, to correct oneself, to learn from others, to teach others, to take 3 steps forward and 1 step back. Exploration, not certainty. When those managing or producing or commentating on artistic expression rattle our sense of worth through a prevailing orthodoxy, it is up to artists to say, step back. And it is up to audiences to say that they do not need moral gatekeepers. They can protest if they wish. They can be activists for art or against it. They can listen or walk out. Like the artists themselves, they're individuals. Like their characters, artists must be free to transgress on the page. We excuse characters' moral failures because we will see ourselves in them. We will see that what befalls them might easily have befallen us. It's not piety that links good citizens, it's moral frailty. In What is Culture For?, the writer imagines how a damning media might treat the greatest heroes in literature. Oedipus, sex with mum was blinding. For Hamlet, boozy foreign aristo dies in fight after killing spree. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, call girl makes psycho killer confess. And Gatsby, fake gent shot in deluxe pool by wrong love rival. In a chapter named Compassion, the writer notes, Without Sophocles, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, or Scott Fitzgerald, we'd never think of the complex, moving, personal histories of individuals that lie behind these harsh summaries. We've been taught by the best teachers to see them through the prism of artistic sympathy and compassion. Artistic sympathy and compassion. To come full circle back to Dad. The early years, working 2 jobs, coming home on the train to Mount Eliza, putting children to bed and then poring over the overland proofs, believing not only that ideas and writing made his world better, but the world. And on a more practical level, that overland sometimes helped artists feed their children, however modestly, and depended on him. How lucky we were, Cleve, David and I, to have had such interesting parents. And as I've said before, how great was the bequest of wonder at the world, at people and at art. This in turn is a part of all 5 of their grandchildren, Joseph, Sophia, Sam, Charlie and Lucy, who are so naturally engaged with other people and so alive to stories. How wonderful the library has Mum and Dad's archive. How sad the lecture series is over. Stephen and Nita's enchantment with their country, its bush, its history, its culture, will live on. Their understanding that the best of life is nuanced, complex, ambiguous, and our search for the best way to live is difficult and endless. I hope somehow, and I think it will, all this and their tender love for the imagination will endure. Thank you very much.